Something changed in the way your soulmate sees you, and they didn't discover it by talking to you directly. They learned something about the person you became after the separation, and for a moment, the story they had been telling themselves about you stopped making sense. Maybe they thought you would remain hurt. Maybe they assumed the separation would make you bitter, distant, or unable to trust again. Perhaps they quietly believed that you would always carry the weight of what happened between you. But then they heard something about your life that completely challenged that image. They discovered that instead of allowing the separation to harden you, you used it to become someone more peaceful, more self-aware, more compassionate, and somehow even more beautiful from the inside. And that realization can hit harder than any dramatic reunion ever could. Imagine leaving a garden during winter, believing everything you once saw there had disappeared, only to return much later and discover that something extraordinary had grown in the exact place you left behind. Your soulmate may have remembered the version of you from the difficult chapter, but they never witnessed the quiet seasons that followed. They didn't see the moments when you rebuilt yourself. They didn't see the nights you chose healing instead of resentment. They didn't see the private decisions that slowly changed your life. And now, somehow, a small piece of information has revealed what they missed. You became better without becoming bitter. You became stronger without losing your softness. You learned from the pain without allowing the pain to define you. And suddenly, they may be asking themselves questions they never expected to ask again. How did they become this person? What happened after I left? Why didn't I know about this? But perhaps the deepest question is the one they are struggling to admit. Did I misunderstand who they really were? Because sometimes distance doesn't erase someone's importance. Sometimes distance removes the noise that prevented you from seeing them clearly. And your soulmate may have just received their first glimpse of that truth. What they discovered about you may have been something surprisingly simple, but emotionally it carried a meaning they couldn't easily ignore. They may have learned that after the separation, you didn't become the person they expected you to become. You didn't spend your life trying to prove that they were wrong. You didn't turn every memory into resentment. You didn't make your pain your identity. Instead, somewhere in the quiet period after everything ended, you began changing in ways they never got to witness. Maybe someone told them that you became more peaceful. Maybe they heard that you started helping people, pursuing something you once only talked about, becoming more patient, or simply learning how to live without constantly looking backward. And that information may have caught them completely off guard, because people often imagine the ending of a connection through the emotions they remember most. If the separation was painful, they may have assumed the pain remained. If there were misunderstandings, they may have assumed the resentment remained. If you were emotional when everything ended, they may have assumed that version of you never really disappeared. But then they learned something that didn't fit the old picture. You were okay, not pretending to be okay, not desperately trying to look okay, actually becoming okay. And there is something deeply powerful about discovering that someone you once cared about didn't allow a painful chapter to destroy the beautiful parts of who they were. Imagine a tree standing in the same place after a violent storm. Someone might remember seeing its branches broken and assume the tree would never recover. Then years later, they return and discover that the branches have grown back differently. The roots have gone deeper, and the tree is stronger because of seasons nobody witnessed. Your soulmate may be seeing you in exactly that way now. They remember the storm, but they never saw the rebuilding. They knew what happened to you, but they didn't know what you did with what happened to you. And that distinction can completely change someone's perspective. They may start realizing that the separation didn't simply take something away from you. It gave you a period of solitude in which you were forced to meet parts of yourself that had been hidden beneath the relationship, the expectations, and the emotional noise. Perhaps you discovered what you actually wanted. Perhaps you learned to set boundaries. Perhaps you stopped chasing people who made you question your worth. Perhaps you became more selective about who receives your energy. Perhaps you learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean returning to the same situation. And if your soulmate heard about any of this, they may have been quietly stunned, because they may have expected your growth to look like distance, coldness, or complete emotional detachment. Instead, they discovered something much more beautiful. You learned how to protect your peace without closing your heart. That can be difficult for someone to process, especially if they once believed the separation would define your relationship with love forever. They may have wondered, did they really heal? Did they actually forgive me? How can they still be such a kind person after everything? And perhaps the answer is that healing didn't erase what happened. It changed what the experience meant to you. You didn't need to pretend the past never happened. You simply stopped allowing the past to control your future. That is a very different kind of strength. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need an audience. It happens privately, through hundreds of small choices nobody sees. Choosing not to respond to something that would have once triggered you. Choosing to walk away instead of arguing. Choosing to wish someone well without needing them to return. Choosing yourself without needing to make anyone else feel guilty for it. Those choices may seem ordinary from the outside, but they reveal an entirely different level of emotional maturity. And perhaps your soulmate discovered one of those details. Maybe they heard that you spoke kindly about them even after everything ended. Maybe they learned that you never tried to turn mutual friends against them. Maybe they discovered that when someone mentioned their name, you didn't react with hatred or bitterness. You simply acknowledged the past and continued living. If that happened, imagine how unexpectedly that could affect them. They may have prepared themselves to believe that you hated them. It might have been easier for them emotionally if you did. Hatred creates distance. Hatred gives people a simple story. But kindness after separation is complicated because it forces someone to ask whether the connection meant something more profound than the ending suggested. They may begin thinking, after everything, they still chose grace? And that question can stay with someone, because perhaps they suddenly understand that your silence was never weakness. Your distance was never revenge. Your healing wasn't an attempt to make them regret losing you. You were simply learning how to become whole again. And when someone realizes that, they may begin revisiting old memories with a different perspective. A conversation they once thought was unnecessary may suddenly seem meaningful. A reaction they once considered dramatic may now look like the response of someone who was genuinely overwhelmed. A boundary they once interpreted as rejection may now look like self-respect. A period of silence they once considered indifference may now look like healing. This is where the perspective shift becomes emotional. They aren't only learning something new about who you are now, they may be reconsidering who you were then. And sometimes that is much more powerful. Imagine looking at an old photograph years later and suddenly noticing something in the background you never paid attention to before. The photograph hasn't changed, you have. And because you have changed, you interpret the same image differently. Your soulmate may be going through something similar. The memories haven't changed, but the person interpreting them has new information. Now they know what happened after the separation. Now they know that you didn't collapse under the weight of it. You evolved. They may even feel a strange combination of admiration and regret. Admiration because they can see the person you became. Regret because they weren't there to witness the process. They may wonder about the moments when you needed someone and had to become that person for yourself. They may wonder how many difficult nights shaped the calmness they now see. They may wonder how many times you almost gave up before choosing to continue. And perhaps that is what makes your transformation so meaningful to them. They didn't see the work. They only saw the result. They saw the flower, not the roots. They saw the confidence, not the uncertainty that came before it. They saw the peace, not the battles you had to fight internally to find it. And now they may understand that the person standing today was built through experiences they were not part of. That realization can create a very quiet kind of longing, not necessarily the desperate desire to recreate the past, but the desire to understand the person you became. They may want to know what changed your perspective. what made you stronger, what you believe now, and whether the person they once knew is still somewhere inside the person you became. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that you don't need to explain any of it. Your life has already become the evidence. Your growth doesn't require their approval. Your healing doesn't depend on whether they recognize it. And your transformation doesn't become more valuable because your soulmate finally noticed. But if they did notice, it may have opened a door inside their mind that can no longer be completely closed. Because now they have to confront a truth they may not have been ready for before. The separation didn't turn you into someone they needed to forget. It may have helped reveal someone they never fully understood in the first place. And once that realization begins, they may start wondering what else they missed. They may start asking themselves whether they truly knew your heart when they had the chance. And that question leads somewhere even deeper, because the next thing they may begin confronting isn't simply what happened to you after the separation. It's what your transformation says about the connection they once shared with you. And this is where the discovery may have become much more personal for your soulmate, because once they learned something beautiful about the person you became after the separation, they couldn't simply file that information away and move on. It may have started changing the way they remembered you. A small detail about your life could have opened the door to an entire collection of memories they had placed somewhere deep inside themselves. Suddenly, moments they once understood one way began looking completely different. Maybe they heard that you had forgiven something you once struggled with. Maybe they learned that you had been quietly helping someone, building something meaningful, pursuing a dream, or becoming the kind of person you once told them you wanted to be. Whatever the detail was, it may have seemed small to everyone else, but to your soulmate, it carried a much bigger message. It told them that the person they knew didn't disappear after the separation. You evolved. And sometimes discovering someone's growth from a distance can be more powerful than witnessing it firsthand, because there is no opportunity to gradually adjust to the changes. They receive the truth all at once. Imagine finding an old letter you wrote years ago and reading it with the knowledge you have today. The words are exactly the same, but suddenly you understand them differently because you have lived through everything that came afterward. Your soulmate may be looking at the memories of your connection in that same way. The past hasn't changed, but their understanding of it may be changing rapidly. They may remember something you said and wonder whether they understood what you meant at the time. They may remember a moment when you pulled away and realize that perhaps you weren't trying to punish them. Maybe you were protecting yourself. They may remember a disagreement and suddenly recognize the fear beneath your words. They may remember how deeply you cared and realize that what they once interpreted as intensity may actually have been sincerity. And that can be uncomfortable because it forces a person to reconsider their own role in a story they thought they already understood. They may begin asking themselves questions they avoided before. Did I appreciate them enough? Was I fair to them? Did I understand what they were trying to tell me? Why did I assume they would always be there? And perhaps the hardest question is, what did I lose when we separated? Notice that this isn't necessarily about regret in the dramatic sense. It may be something quieter, a realization that arrives slowly, almost like sunlight entering a room after a long night. They may not suddenly decide that everything should go back to the way it was. Instead, they may begin seeing the emotional value of the connection with greater maturity. They may understand that some people don't leave your life without leaving an imprint, and your growth may have made that imprint more visible. Perhaps before the separation, they focused heavily on what wasn't working between you. They remembered the arguments, the uncertainty, the differences, the moments when neither of you knew what to say. But now they may be learning about the person you became afterward, and that new information is forcing them to remember the other side too. The laughter, the comfort, the strange familiarity, the conversations that felt effortless, the moments when you understood each other without needing everything explained. Those memories may begin returning with a different emotional color. What once felt ordinary may suddenly feel precious. What once seemed small may suddenly seem meaningful. Imagine standing in a room after the furniture has been removed. Only when everything is gone do you notice how much of the room's character came from what used to be there. Your soulmate may be experiencing something similar. Distance has removed the daily noise, and now they can see the emotional shape of the connection more clearly. And perhaps the most beautiful discovery is that you didn't become cruel because of what happened. You didn't allow disappointment to destroy your ability to care. You may have learned how to love with stronger boundaries, how to give without abandoning yourself, and how to forgive without forgetting what you learned. That kind of transformation can deeply affect someone who once knew you differently. They may have assumed that your healing would make you colder toward them, but instead they may hear that you speak about the past with understanding. Maybe you don't speak about them often at all. Maybe when their name comes up, you simply acknowledge what happened and continue with your life. That can be unexpectedly emotional because it means you didn't need revenge to move forward. You didn't need them to suffer in order to heal. You didn't need an apology to validate your experience. You found your own closure, and your soulmate may realize that this is a strength they never recognized while they were close to you. They may think they really became stronger than I ever knew, and once that thought appears, curiosity can become impossible to ignore. They may start wondering what you believe now. What matters to you now? What kind of relationship would you accept now? What boundaries would you have? What dreams are you chasing? What parts of your old self did you leave behind? And perhaps they wonder whether they would even recognize the person you are today if they were given another chance to sit across from you. That uncertainty can be emotional because they may realize they don't have automatic access to you anymore. They can't simply rely on old memories to understand you. If they ever came back into your life, they would have to meet the present version of you. They would have to listen differently. They would have to understand that your growth happened whether they witnessed it or not. And that may be the point where admiration quietly replaces the assumptions they once carried. They may realize that you didn't become better to make them regret losing you. You became better because life demanded that you choose yourself. You became stronger because you had to learn how to stand without the support you once expected. You became more peaceful because you finally understood that not every situation deserves your emotional energy. You became more compassionate because pain taught you something about other people's struggles. And you became more selective because you finally learned the difference between being wanted and being valued. Those lessons can change a person permanently. Your soulmate may be discovering the results of those lessons now, long after the circumstances that created them have passed. And that can create a strange emotional realization. Perhaps they didn't lose you because you stopped caring. Perhaps they lost access to you because you learned how to care about yourself too. That distinction may completely change the way they remember the separation. They may no longer see it simply as two people drifting apart. They may start seeing it as a turning point that forced both of you into different stages of growth. And while they may not know exactly what their role is in your life now, they may finally understand that the person they once knew deserved more understanding than they gave. That doesn't mean the past needs to be rewritten. It means it can finally be understood with greater clarity. And perhaps that is the beautiful thing your soulmate recently discovered. They didn't simply learn that you survived the separation. They learned that you transformed it into something meaningful. You took what hurt and turned it into wisdom. You took what confused you and turned it into clarity. You took what broke your expectations and used it to build stronger ones. And now, when they look back at you, they may no longer see someone defined by the ending. They may see someone who used the ending as a doorway into a completely different version of themselves. That realization can stay with a person because it raises one final question they may not be ready to answer yet. If you became this beautiful version of yourself after they left, who would you become if they ever crossed your path again? And now, the part that may be affecting your soulmate more than they expected is not simply what you became, but the realization that they were not there to witness it. They may have discovered one beautiful detail about your life, but that detail opened a much larger question inside them. Who is this person now? Because the version of you they remember belongs to a different chapter. They remember your voice, your habits, your reactions, your dreams at that time, maybe even the way you looked at them when you believed the connection still had somewhere to go. But they don't know the person who emerged after everything changed. They don't know how many difficult decisions you made quietly. They don't know which parts of yourself you had to rebuild. They don't know what you stopped tolerating, what you started valuing, or what finally became important to you. And that uncertainty can create a strange emotional pull. Imagine opening a familiar book years later and discovering that the pages you thought were blank actually contained an entire story you never knew existed. You remember the beginning, but you missed the middle. Now your soulmate may be realizing that there was an entire chapter of your life happening beyond their view. They may wonder what you were thinking during those silent periods. They may wonder whether you ever thought about them. They may wonder whether the person they knew is still somewhere inside you, or whether life completely transformed your heart. And perhaps they are asking themselves the question they never expected. Would I even know how to approach them now? Because growth changes the emotional distance between two people. When someone evolves, the old ways of relating to them don't always work anymore. The assumptions that once felt safe become unreliable. The old triggers may no longer produce the same reactions. The old methods of communication may suddenly feel inadequate. And if your soulmate has heard that you became more grounded, more confident, more peaceful, or more independent, they may sense that something about your energy is different. They may not be able to explain it, but they can feel the difference through what others tell them, through what they see from a distance, or through the small traces of your life that occasionally reach them. They may start wondering whether you still carry the same emotional space for them. Do they still remember me? Or would they care if they heard from me? Have they completely moved on? Those questions can become surprisingly powerful because they reveal something important. They are no longer certain where they stand in your world. Before, perhaps they assumed they understood your feelings. Maybe they believed you would always care, always remember, or always remain emotionally connected to what happened between you. But your growth may have removed that certainty. You didn't necessarily tell them you changed. You simply changed. And now they have to interpret your silence, your independence, and your new life without the certainty they once had. Imagine standing outside a house you used to know by heart and realizing the windows are still there, but the entire interior has been redesigned. You recognize the place, but you no longer know what happens inside. That may be how your soulmate feels about you now. Familiar yet unfamiliar, close in memory, distant in reality. And that emotional contradiction can create longing, curiosity, and even a quiet sense of regret. They may begin thinking about what it would be like to meet you again without the old story hanging between you. Would the conversation feel awkward? Would it feel natural? Would you be warm? Would you be guarded? Would you even want to hear what they have to say? They may not have answers, and uncertainty has a way of making old feelings surface again. But here's something important. Their curiosity doesn't necessarily mean you are supposed to wait for them. Your growth happened for you. Your transformation belongs to you. Whether they return, remain distant, or simply continue watching from afar doesn't determine the value of what you became. In fact, that may be exactly what makes your transformation so meaningful. You didn't change because you were waiting for someone to notice. You changed because life taught you that you couldn't remain the same person forever. And if your soulmate is now noticing that transformation, they are simply seeing the evidence of work you already completed. They may feel proud of you. They may feel surprised by you. They may even feel a little emotional because some part of them realizes they missed moments they can never get back. They weren't there for the first time you chose peace over proving your point. They weren't there when you finally stopped questioning your worth. They weren't there when you realized that being alone wasn't the same as being lost. They weren't there when you began building a future based on what you truly wanted, rather than what you hoped someone else would choose for you. Those are invisible milestones, but they create visible changes. And perhaps your soulmate has now caught a glimpse of the result. That can be powerful because people often understand someone's value differently once they see what happens when that person stops living according to old expectations. Maybe you became more ambitious. Maybe you became more creative. Maybe you became more emotionally mature. Maybe you simply became peaceful in a way they never saw before. Whatever it is, they may now understand that your life continued beautifully without their presence. And that realization can bring conflicting emotions. Happiness for you, sadness about the distance, curiosity about your current life, regret about certain choices, even gratitude for what the connection once taught them. They may not know what to do with all those feelings yet. Sometimes the first stage isn't action. It's recognition. It's sitting quietly with a new understanding and allowing it to rearrange everything you thought you knew. Your soulmate may be doing exactly that. They may be replaying old moments, but this time they are watching them through a different lens. They may recognize that you were growing even then, just in ways they couldn't see. They may realize that some of the qualities they appreciate about you today were already present back then, but they were too distracted by circumstances to recognize them. And that can be one of the most painful realizations of all. Sometimes we understand someone's value only after life removes the familiarity that made us take them for granted. But there is also something beautiful about this realization. It means your story with them isn't defined only by what went wrong. There was something real enough to leave an imprint, something meaningful enough that learning about your growth still affects them now. And perhaps this is why the news about you touched them so unexpectedly. They weren't simply hearing that you were doing well. They were hearing that the person they once knew had become someone even more aligned with the qualities they may have admired all along. They may have expected time to erase the emotional connection, but instead, time gave them perspective, distance gave them context, and your transformation gave them something they didn't have before, a clearer understanding of who you really were. So if you have been wondering why this particular discovery could affect them so deeply, perhaps it is because it forces them to confront a truth that cannot be easily undone. You didn't remain frozen in the moment they left. You continued. You learned. You healed. You built. You became. And now they are looking at the result from a distance, realizing that while they remember the person you were, the world has already introduced you to the person you were always capable of becoming. And somewhere in that realization, another question may be quietly forming in their heart. If I were to meet this new version of them today, would they still see a place for me in their life? That question is where everything becomes even more emotionally complicated, because now they are no longer simply remembering the past. They are wondering about the possibility of a future they can no longer assume belongs to them. And this is where the realization may settle deepest inside your soulmate, because after everything they have learned about the person you became, they can no longer look at your story through the same lens. They may have once believed the separation was simply the end of something that had become too complicated, too painful, or too uncertain. They may have convinced themselves that time would eventually erase the emotional weight of it. But now they are discovering that time didn't erase you. It revealed you. It gave you space to become someone they never had the opportunity to fully know. And perhaps that is what has affected them most. They are not simply hearing that you are doing better. They are realizing that you became better in ways that don't depend on anyone else. You didn't rebuild yourself so someone would return. You didn't become stronger so someone would regret leaving. You didn't create a new life as a performance for the person who walked away. You simply kept moving until one day you looked around and realized that the person who once felt lost was no longer there. In their place was someone who understood themselves more deeply, valued their peace more carefully, and no longer needed the past to explain their worth. Imagine someone leaving a story halfway through and assuming they already know how it ends. Years later, they open the final pages and discover that the character they thought would remain broken became the strongest person in the entire story. That may be the emotional shock your soulmate is experiencing now. They remember the difficult chapter, but they never saw the transformation that followed it. And because they didn't witness it, they may now be trying to understand how much changed while they were away. They may wonder whether you still remember the connection with tenderness. They may wonder whether you ever look back. They may wonder whether the person they once knew still exists somewhere beneath everything you have become. But there is another question that may be even harder for them to answer. Where do I fit into this version of their life? Because your transformation changes the equation. Before, perhaps they felt certain about your emotional position. They knew what you wanted, what you feared, what you expected. But now they may not know. Your life has continued without requiring their participation, and that can be both beautiful and confronting. They may realize that if they ever wanted to reconnect, they couldn't simply walk back into the old dynamic and expect everything to feel the same. They would have to meet you where you are now. They would have to understand the person standing in front of them, rather than trying to recreate the person they remember. And perhaps that is why this discovery touched them so unexpectedly. It didn't just make them miss you. It made them recognize the distance between who you were together and who you became apart. That distance contains everything you learned, every boundary you developed, every fear you released, every dream you finally allowed yourself to pursue, every time you chose yourself when choosing yourself felt uncomfortable. Your soulmate may suddenly understand that there were parts of your transformation they could never have created for you. Those were lessons you had to discover alone, and strangely, that may make them admire you even more. They may realize that your strength wasn't something you borrowed from someone else. It came from within you. They may remember moments when you needed reassurance, and now understand that you eventually learned how to give that reassurance to yourself. They may remember moments when you were uncertain and realize that uncertainty eventually became wisdom. They may remember your vulnerability and now see that it was never weakness. It was evidence that you cared deeply. And perhaps that is the final perspective shift. They stop seeing your past sensitivity as something that made you difficult and begin seeing it as something that made you genuine. They stop seeing your boundaries as rejection and begin seeing them as self-respect. They stop seeing your silence as distance and begin understanding it as healing. They stop seeing your growth as moving on from them and begin understanding that growth was never about moving away from anyone. It was about moving closer to yourself. That distinction can completely change how someone remembers a relationship. And perhaps your soulmate is realizing that now. They may even feel a strange gratitude for the connection, not because everything that happened was perfect, but because something about it helped shape the person you became. Sometimes people don't recognize the meaning of a chapter while they're living inside it. They understand it years later when they can finally see what it contributed to the larger story. Your soulmate may be reaching that point now. They may be looking back and realizing that the relationship wasn't simply a beginning that failed to become a permanent ending. It was an experience that changed both people. It taught lessons neither of you could have learned in exactly the same way elsewhere. And perhaps your growth is reminding them of their own unfinished growth. Your transformation may be holding up a mirror. They may start asking themselves what they became after the separation. Did they heal? Did they learn? Did they change? Did they become the person they wanted to become? And if the answer isn't as clear as they hoped, that could make your transformation feel even more powerful to them. Because while you were quietly rebuilding your life, they may have been carrying assumptions about you that were never updated. Now those assumptions are collapsing. They may have thought you were still waiting. They may have thought you couldn't move forward. They may have believed that the separation left you emotionally stuck. But discovering who you became forces them to confront a different reality. You moved forward without needing to erase what happened. You grew without pretending the connection never mattered. You healed without becoming heartless. And that is a rare kind of closure. It doesn't require hatred. It doesn't require forgetting. It simply means the past no longer controls the present. So perhaps the most beautiful thing your soulmate has discovered isn't actually one specific accomplishment or one particular quality. Perhaps it is the realization that your heart survived. After everything, you still found reasons to care. You still found reasons to hope. You still allowed yourself to build something meaningful. You didn't let one painful chapter convince you that the entire story would be painful. And if your soulmate truly understands that, they may see you with a level of respect they didn't possess before. They may think, I didn't know they had this much strength. They may wonder, how did they become so different? And maybe somewhere beneath those questions is a quiet ache because they realize they weren't there to see it happen. But remember this, their realization does not need to become your destination. You don't need to stop your life and wait for their perspective to turn into action. You don't need to prove anything. The beautiful thing is that you already became the person they are only now beginning to understand. Whether they reach out or remain silent, whether they admit what they feel or keep it hidden, your transformation remains yours. And perhaps that is exactly why it affected them so deeply. They realized your growth was real because it wasn't performed for them. It existed without their applause. It continued without their permission. It became part of who you are. And now, when they look at you from whatever distance exists between your lives, they may finally understand something they couldn't see before. They didn't simply lose a person. They lost the opportunity to witness an extraordinary transformation from the beginning. They remember the person who entered their life, but they are now hearing about the person who emerged from everything that followed. And that can create a powerful emotional realization. Maybe the separation was not the moment your story ended. Maybe it was the moment your story changed direction. Maybe you were never meant to remain the same person you were when they knew you. Maybe the distance gave you both something the closeness couldn't provide, perspective. And if your soulmate is now looking back with new eyes, perhaps they are finally seeing the beauty that was there all along. Not because you became worthy after they left, but because time finally gave them the maturity to recognize what they couldn't fully appreciate before. So let them have their realization. Let them wonder. Let them remember. Let them sit with the truth of who you became. You don't need to chase their understanding. You don't need to return to an old version of yourself to make the story feel familiar. Keep becoming. Keep building. Keep choosing the life that feels honest to you. Because the most powerful ending isn't your soulmate finally realizing your value. The most powerful ending is you realizing that your value was never dependent on whether they recognized it. And perhaps, somewhere tonight, they are quietly coming to the same conclusion. The person they once knew didn't disappear after the separation. That person evolved. And now they are left wondering whether the beautiful soul they once knew still has any space in the extraordinary life you built after they were gone.